welcome. Goodness, it's it's wonderful to look at the gallery view and see all these people. My name is Kathleen Chalfant, and I'll be your host today. As you know, the Salon today is about uh, the domestic violence during the great COVID hunker. And we have a remarkable panel of people to discuss it, talk you through it, answer questions you might have. And also, we're going to do a little bit of what Shakespeare said, which is hold a mirror up to life. But first, I'd like our panelists to introduce themselves quickly. They are Lia Avellino, Raquel Almazan, and Bea Hanson. And that's alphabetical, so you can introduce yourselves in that order. Lia, you're muted.
Sorry, muted. Here you go. I'm back. Hi, everyone. My name is Lia Avellino, and I am a relational psychotherapist with training in mind and body-based interventions, as well as social justice. And I am also the director of Head and Heart at the Well, where I facilitate support.
My phone. I don't know where your phone is.
And I specialize in women's issues and sexual and gender-based traumas.
Hello, everyone. My name is Raquel Almazan. I'm a theater artist, facilitator, and an activist. For the last 20 years, I've been working with survivors in incarcerated setting and post-incarcerated settings where survivors have been criminalized due to responding to their abusers. And I also want to state that I myself, I'm also a survivor of domestic abuse, and I came to storytelling really through the experiences that I had in shelters, which brought me into the field of theater. So I'm dedicated to intersecting activism for women's rights and professional theater making.
Dave.
Hi, everybody. My name is Bea Hanson, and so happy to be here with all of you and my co-panelists, and Kathy for hosting. I head up the Domestic Violence Task Force for the City of New York through the Mayor's office, and just really happy that Rattlestick Theater is doing this work and shining a light on the issue of domestic violence. So thank you for inviting us all.
A little thank you all. We're very happy you're here. A little housekeeping. After the discussion among the panelists, there'll be time for questions. And if you have a general question, send it to Daniela on the chat function. And if you have a private question for any of the panelists, you can also send it privately to them and they'll deal with it at another time. Not a very long time, but soon. So give them a way to be in contact with you. And now to begin, we're going to do something Shakespearean, which is to hold, as I mentioned, a mirror up to life. Marin Ireland and Eboni Booth, two remarkable theater artists, will read two excerpts from Marin's play, Preexisting Condition.
First, I just want to say that I'm really honored to be here among these incredible panelists, and grateful to share a little bit of this. And I just for context, I just wanted to say that when I was writing it, I was thinking about how we only really learn the language for processing and understanding things like domestic violence or abuse, usually after things have already happened to us. So I was interested in trying to bring that language more out in the open in a very direct way and see what that could be like. So some of the play is right in the middle of a support group setting. So the first excerpt that I'm going to read is one of the support group moderators, and Ebony's piece right after that is a woman speaking to a therapist, and then Kathy's piece at the end is also another moderator. We don't think we deserve things, so how would we ask for them? That's big. I can see you guys nodding. I know that's a big one. Also, it just makes it all sound hard, right? Like, where's the fun, easy breezy part of love? But here's the thing, and I say this a lot. If you went on a first date with someone and they were wearing a sign around their neck that said, "I hit women," or "I'm going to punch you in the face," you probably wouldn't go out with them again, right? But people don't. Yeah, maybe they should. But what happens instead, as you know, is you meet someone and you fall in love. And maybe there are some red flags along the way, and maybe you notice them and maybe you don't. Maybe you even say something like, "When you yell like that, it scares me," or whatever it might be. But we all are conditioned to try to make it work, especially women, right? We think if we work hard enough, we can do it, make the relationship work, no matter what problems come up. If we really love him, or if we have kids and we don't want to split up because of them, whatever it might be. You know, the number one reason women say they don't leave an abusive relationship is because of her kids. And the number one reason women do leave an abusive relationship is because of her kids.
This woman, she told us about how she ended up at the support group. And, you know, we were talking about how people never understand why calling the cops doesn't fix anything. You know, like there are so many people who have this idea about cops, like out of the movies, like something goes wrong, obviously they call the police and then it's going to be okay. And that's never what it's actually like, especially in a big city. You know, and it's not just about how cops are corrupt or the laws are outdated, but just, you know, it's simpler than that. There's no savior out there. It's not the end of a movie, and if you just get to the phone in time, you'll be okay. And this woman, she said that there was a cop that lived on the street from her, and he knew her and her husband. And one day she decided she'd had enough, and she went down to his house with a black eye and asked him for help. And he laughed and shut the door and told her husband about it later. And then she said that a little while later, she thought it was her last day on earth because her husband had a gun and he told her their kid was going to be motherless and they were fighting. And this woman brought the fight outside because she thought it was her best hope just to get it out in the open. And suddenly they hear, "Stop, police." And her husband pushed her down and he ran off. And the woman looked up and there was just this lady standing there. And she had shouted that to get him to stop, and it worked. And the craziest thing was that this woman was lost. Like, she had an address in her hand and she was trying to find a house on that street. And she asked the woman if she had any kids, and then she said, "Get your daughter and let's go." And the woman never looked back. And she refers to this lady as her angel. And she's still in touch with her. The lady took her and her daughter to a shelter, and they call each other, and she's one of her closest friends now. Can you believe that?
Since all of us, we're all in a virtual theater, and we've just had a virtual performance, the work that many of us who are here do, and it's our way of responding to the world, of doing what Shakespeare asks us to do, tells us we're doing. And so I think we should just have a conversation among our remarkable panelists, and we could begin by just responding to what you've heard, how it resonates in your work, what it did to you.
Mhm.
Somebody jump in.
Sure, I'll jump in. The very specific moment of the police officer laughing in her face and closing the door, I think for me brought up a very, very visceral memory of obtaining restraining orders through a process. And being told by police officers a number of times, just in my own, recalling my own personal experience and the experience of the women that I worked with, that the police would often say, we can't further help you unless something happens. Mm-hmm. So it's almost the conditions in which they are even set up in terms of the levels of protection, that we can't help you until you're assaulted, so so I was just thinking about the ways in which the everyday citizen, and also the ones that are upheld to protect us, actually enable the abuse to continue. So that's something that for me just was very visceral.
Yeah, I think for me, that I think the piece about talking about an absolute stranger intervening, and how infrequent I think that happens, and how much, if we're really going to try to end domestic violence, that kind of thing needs to happen more, where people get involved. Because I think Raquel's point about the police is that, the police they're sort of limited in what they're doing around arrest, but so much of what domestic violence at least starts at is this kind of insidious kind of belittling and telling you you're no good, and the kind of violence that, even if it does allow for arrest, often means the person's out that day or the next day. So how do we as a society think about what we can do? And so that made me think about that piece about this woman who's a total stranger, lost, who actually is smart enough to say, stop police, and helps provide some incredible support to a woman and her child.
Yeah, that was so powerful to experience. And I think one thing that really stood out to me was, in a lot of the women's support circles that I've been facilitating, is there's this assumption that we know what we need, and that we can communicate those needs safely, when many of us have received very different messages about those needs. And I think that this idea of getting support when we need it is not something that many of us have access to. And at this particular moment in time, where so many communities who were already not getting what they needed are now isolated at home, that there's this assumption going around that we're all in this together, but we're all in this from very distinct circumstances, and that many of our needs are invisible and cannot be met in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really brings to mind, as what you were saying, Lia, that the communities that I worked with, specifically undocumented Latinx women, it just creates that barrier where the police is not an option. So it sets off an entirely different set of a chain of events for possible deportation, where, it's part of the headlines now, where a young girl went to the police disclosing the abuse that her father was enacting at home, physical and sexual, and she's in the process of being deported as a teenager. So I think it's that barrier, that the authorities are just, unfortunately for undocumented women, it poses that extra barrier of seeking help. And so then how is it that as communities are we creating other forms of support? Because it's just not available for undocumented people. And that's specifically when I'm thinking about COVID. It's an entirely set of different conditions, especially when they're not receiving stimulus checks. Mm-hmm. It's just like a breeding ground, from all different sides of internal and external, like an external force and also internal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, part of what this pandemic has created is just a spotlight on all of these issues that, have always been there, and it just exacerbates it, so, we know that COVID impacts Black and Brown communities disproportionately, and so does so does domestic violence, and so does poverty, and so do all of these other issues. And I think the hope is, in some ways, that we don't lose sight of this particular moment where we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we're seeing things kind of to me, it feels like a sharper focus. Mm-hmm. And how do we not lose this real need to be able to provide access to services for people that's beyond law enforcement and beyond shelter? How do we help survivors stay in their home? How do we help survivors stay in their community? And supporting undocumented survivors who often can't get the kinds of benefits that people that are documented and are able to get. So that I'm hoping we can make that kind of shift after this, and that brings that about.
Yeah, I think too, along that line, that there's, like Raquel was saying, there's what's happening in the home, but then there's what's bearing down on the home. And as we're noticing more violence being perpetuated at a government level, we're also noticing stress impacting what's happening in the home, and then a lack of resources that supports alleviating that stress and access to those resources.
Yeah. Yeah, and I often think about what happens, not only in isolation, but when for me, I'm watching patriarchal violence in such a visible way, where every day that it comes onto the news, it becomes more and more normalized. And when vulnerable communities are intentionally being attacked, it's almost like I feel like it's like intentional cultural erasure, and it's like an intentional breeding ground to create these conditions for more violence to happen. And so I think it is very, very intentional, but I don't, the kind of programming that I'm watching, just for myself, even as a survivor, watching so much male violence being inflicted across the world, and specifically in the US, those images of men just so whimsically just making these choices that are disproportionately affecting people of color and women during this time.
Yeah, I think, I think for like, how do we shift that? How do we shift that paradigm to and I think part of it is how the whole issue of women, and it makes me think of sexual violence issues as well, about how how many times can a man rape women before before an arrest happens and before all of that stuff happens. And I think that there's, how do we shift, also support women's consciousness to speak out and support each other to believe women and believe what we're saying, because there's so many voices in our head saying, no, that really wasn't a big deal. It was my fault. I should have done something in a different way. That all of those things, and how do we kind of rejigger that in some way? Mm-hmm. The last event I got to go to before COVID shut everything down was in Brooklyn, and Rebecca Solnit came and spoke, and she wrote this book called Men Explain Things to Me, and it was really about like that whole issue of women, and how do we find ground and find our voices. And that's why theater is so important, and the work, Raquel, that you're doing is so important in theater, and bringing that about. And Lia, the work that you're doing around bringing circles together is just so critical.
Yeah, right. It's sort of like, how do we undo that patriarchal voice that we've ingested, right? That's not our voice, but sounds like it. And I think, like you're saying, Bea and Raquel, one way to do that is through connection. So healing happens in connection, and lives in isolation. One of the major challenges about is that women used to be able to leave their house to come to support circles, right? And and leave their house to just escape the violence or the fear and terror that was going on inside the house. And that isn't an option right now. And although digital circles do provide spaces for connection, many people aren't in a space where they either have access to digital resources, or if they do, that their partner or their abuser's in the space with them. And so one way that I've been approaching that, and my colleagues, is really assuming no wrong door and no missed opportunity, that we are going into these circles knowing that people at home are unsafe, and providing resources and different ways of thinking, and grounding techniques and ways of sort of accessing outside of the home, not waiting for someone to tell that there's a problem, because we know that that might not be safe.
Yeah. I think about that. Thank you so much for saying that, Bea. And I know the turning point for myself was when I was living in a domestic violence shelter. I was first introduced to this concept of theater through the storytelling and through the women sharing each other's narratives, and how we became each other's support networks after we left the shelter, because so many of us were thinking, like, what is that next step? Because the resources are so limited. And it really became those connective tissues through telling each other stories. I didn't realize that this was like really the heart or aspect of theater that was transformative, because if we had not heard each other's stories, we were stuck in shame. And we couldn't get out of the mindset of being ashamed. But then once we shared each other's stories, then we became each other's resources. And if someone didn't have something, like, I remember one time a woman called, "I don't have food." Another woman, we helped each other get, helped get cleaning jobs together. Like, we became each other's resources. And so I think historically women have had to fight to get their own space. And so I'm looking at that and like, why am I fighting so hard to get into these masculine spaces that are so masculine dominated? So I'm thinking now, it's like, how can we create spaces that are designed by women for women during this crisis? Because many times I think the priority, just as I've seen in healthcare, why so many people of color are being disproportionately affected, we're last on the list. And I'm thinking, like, unless we really look at we prioritize women who are in these conditions, I think we have to kind of rethink and create like a radical framework about what does it look like to have a space. What does safe space look like now during isolation? Like, I'm thinking a lot about that.
Do you have an idea about that, Raquel?
Well, what I have done in the past is, I think you have to put yourself outside of your comfort zone. On the street, when you're walking down the street or in your local communities, if I see a woman, even if I think she's being abused by someone, I step in. This has always been my way. I know because I was in a position in the past where, one of the neighboring, two women who were neighbors of us stepped in, and it was the only way to create a safe space. So I often do that myself. And sometimes people say, don't mind your own business, or I put my own body at risk when I see the abuse happening. A lot of times I feel that we see the abuse happening in physical spaces and we're not saying anything. Nobody's stepping in, and it's an uncomfortable barrier to knock on somebody's door in your building and say, "I heard something. Are you okay?" I think it's like we have to get past these comfortable barriers. I think now during this time, anytime you have the opportunity, I think in your local, even the communities that you're in now, I think, like Bea, you were saying this earlier, that we're hearing and seeing things that perhaps we weren't seeing before. And I don't think there's a polite way to do this work, is what I'm saying. I think that we have to kind of cross that uncomfortable barrier to identify and be in solidarity. What does it mean to be an allyship? That's something also that I'm thinking a lot about.
Yeah, I think, when we were doing our prep call, I was talking about this, there's a homicide in East Harlem just, during COVID, just like a week and a half ago. And, and it was a call in from a neighbor, and it just makes you think about it, especially now when people are at home, like you were saying, Raquel, like what are people hearing? And then, what are people doing about it? And I think it's difficult. I think it's difficult to shift that make that move, because I think, what your interventions are it's very brave and very strong. And, not everyone would do that. But yet, how do we push ourselves in some way to take kind of a community responsibility and in some level and a care, it's really comes from, compassion and care for each other, which I think these kinds of crises, can create, and that we can hopefully continue.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that COVID has really brought to light how powerful interconnection is, even in a negative way, with the spread of a virus, like how the globe has been affected, right? And I think the home gives an illusion of seclusion, right? That we are separate. What happens in that person's home is their business. What happens in that person's home is their business, and sort of really with a collective community mindset, to use your word, Raquel, solidarity, and feeling a responsibility with your privilege, or I should say my privilege, as someone who's safe in my home, and can practice listening and feels responsible to use that safety. I also hear a lot from people that they don't know what to do. Like, I don't trust calling the police if I hear something. Like, what do I do? Where do I go? So I think also like a public health intervention that gives people the resources of here is what's out there, so that they can feel empowered to use their voice in that way, not sort of, well, I don't know what to do, so I'm not going to do anything at all. I also think, and Raquel brought this up too on our planning call, about using community spaces. And although we can't gather in community spaces right now, a lot of what we're doing in support circles is radical visioning, that we know that imagination is an incredibly powerful tool. And so thinking about how we can bring gathering spaces to the community, not asking the community to go to other white or unsafe spaces. So an example of that is, before COVID, we were running the support circles in laundromats. Like, they don't need to be clinical. They don't need to be in an environment that's inaccessible. It can be right where women are at.
Yeah, and I think that's what's critical. That's what's critical. And I think what you had said before, Lia, about like knowing resources and knowing what's out there, and how do we do that ahead of time? Not wait until, it's like the same thing. It's like, you should know where your local emergency room is, before you have an emergency, and, where you would want to go. And it's, it's the same thing about, like, if something happens to me or somebody who I care about, what are the resources available in our community? And so, I know that Daniela was putting some stuff out in the chat, but some resources that are available, here in the city, and there's nyc.gov/NYC Hope has got resources of small community-based organizations and neighborhoods all over the city, as well as large domestic violence social service organizations. So, being aware of what's available in your community is critical.
Yeah. Yeah, I often think too about the movement in movements in Latin America, and in Spain, where my mother lives. There are so many deaths per week in Spain. Partner violence is so common there that almost in every single subway cart, every 2-3 minutes on the television, there's a commercial of domestic violence and places to call that it's not police or authoritative based. And it's now it's kind of become part of the consciousness. In Latin America, they say ni una más, not one more. And so I think it's now, when I think ni una más, it's like visual. Now there's like groups of women like in the neighborhoods where because the women have marched together, who to call in the neighborhood. They're going to come, like, whose door to knock on, or who's checking, because it's become such like a visible part of the culture. And I think that For myself, I'm also a little bit still shocked in New York City sometimes, where it's like the lack of access, or it's still stigmatized, still very stigmatized. And I look to see a lot of what's happening in Latin America or in Spain, you know, the visibility of where to get help, or just even having a saying in your mind of solidarity, of, you know, it's very, very conditioned in people's minds of like, where do I go to get help? And I'm thinking about it then in contrast to the United States, where it's not as visible.
You know, because in some way that your job is to make it visible and provide resources from an official point of view. And I just, while Raquel was talking, I just wondered how many men are in your office? Is it a woman-driven office or not? And how does that affect the way it works, do you think?
Yeah.
I mean, it's mostly women, but not all women. We have, you know, some men that are working with us as well, but it's women, you know, kind of women run, women driven in a lot of ways. You know, I think this whole field of domestic violence and all of the advocacy around domestic violence has often been women driven. But more and more we see men involved in this work. You know, men who want to do something to make a change in terms of providing support for women who model healthy relationships. You know, men who've experienced domestic violence themselves, men who've grown up in households where there's been violence, and we see more and more men involved, which I think is really important and really critical. You know, you know, the cynical side says, well, it's a patriarchal society. People, you know, men listen to men, but we all have to be involved, and I think that's been important. But it remains a female-driven movement in many ways.
There are some questions that I wonder if we can throw forward, if that's okay, because they're coming at they're coming at me. So I think there's some questions more about resources that people would love to know more about. What are the resources that you all recommend for people who do step in? What do you do if you step in?
Strategy, sort of, for
strategies, yeah. Raquel, you want to start? You had some good strategies.
Yes, absolutely. I think it really does have to do with it's case by case, and your documentation status is very important. You know, in the cases I've worked with survivors, or a lot of times I've had students whose mothers are undocumented and there's abuse in the home. I do have to go. The strategy does have to be quite careful. For me, the strategy is not to pick up the phone and call the police, right? Unless there's like immediate, you know, physical danger and they must get out of the home. I often will then, you know, refer the student to an organization where they can specifically get resources where I know they're not going to be put, you know, the status of them being able to continue to live in this country is not going to be endangered. I think that each of these resources have to be very nuanced, you know. Then I've also worked with communities of women that are coming out of post-incarceration because they've responded to their abuser, where it's you know, if someone is about to take my life in a domestic violence situation, I think it is the right of women to respond. And unfortunately, in this process, women are criminalized for self-defense, for maintaining their own lives. So I think that you really have to look at it case by case. I myself have done a variety of different strategies, from if I hear there's noise happening, before I call the police, I knock on the door. And a lot of times when the abuser knows that someone is watching, it really changes the dynamics, because all of a sudden they're made aware that what's happening is not in isolation, and that it really reinforces the position that women are in and says, wow, maybe I am going to go speak to someone. You know, I think that if women have children, it's a very different status of whether the person's alone. I work a lot with an organization called Steps to End Family Violence, and they also have an approach where that there's this idea that it's only on the victim to transform their own lives. And myself, I think the strategy is that those who have perpetrated this abuse and this violence are responsible for their own transformation as well. That men have to have a vocabulary and have to go through a training as well, because if not, this person is just going to continue to perpetuate this kind of violence. So for me, the strategies have to be very specific. If I hear a noise in my own building, I have crossed the boundary to go and knock on someone's door and ask her, what kind of help can I offer? Not everybody's in a place to open their homes, but I can tell you that in many occasions it has saved women's lives to know that there's someone else in the building that's watching. Mm-hmm. And then having different resources. I provided a list of different resources for different vulnerable communities at this time. But yes, if you have other questions about strategies, because I think that it has to be based. I think it's people to get involved in their communities, but then it also has to be supported, I think, by an organization that can service that particular demographic. It's very different when someone's coming post-incarceration or if someone's undocumented, or I think women have different needs. And I think to have as opposed to one place, I think it's important to have like nuanced resources or a different kinds of list to know where to go.
Mm-hmm. So, and on the resources, I believe that everybody who RSVP'd got an attachment in the last, reminder that has a list of resources, that some of which have been mentioned here, but you can definitely reference all of that. There was a comment about just how this issue is tied to the Me Too movement. Curious what all of your, thoughts or impressions are about the connection of the Me Too movement to everything we're discussing here.
To me, it's all connected. It's all about gendered violence in a lot of ways, and I don't want to lose the LGBT community in this as well, because I think while a lot of violence is men against women, that there's also violence happening in same-sex relationships and men as survivors of this violence as well. But I think, Me Too was really, I think, it can, while it's focused on sexual violence, also applies to domestic violence about in terms of Me Too, about how do we come forward as experiencing violence and being brave enough to talk about it when so many times people are blaming us for the violence that's been inflicted on us, that I think it all connects. I think, we tend to, as a society, put things in one little box. It's like, this person is a victim of sexual assault, this person is a victim of domestic violence, this person's homeless, when the reality is a lot of people are all of these things, and so, when we talk about sexual violence, that sexual violence often happens in relationship, whether it's a long-term or short-term relationship. So to me, those things are very connected.
They feel connected to me in sort of who is safe enough to speak out and who is listening when that person speaks their voice. And I think one thing I'm noticing right now in working with individuals and groups through therapy is that a lot of past trauma, related to sexual abuse or gender-based violence is coming up in this particular moment, because people are feeling trapped. Even if they're not currently at risk, they were, or they're not currently in a violent situation, they experienced it in the past. And when we feel trapped and our nervous systems don't have means of escape, that it can feel really, really present. The past can really weigh on us. And bring up past memories, past griefs, losses. And so that's one thing that I'm hearing a lot of people, just the past feeling very present for people.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so glad that you had this question, because I think it's also about the institutional response to violence. I think that communities have their own response to violence, or, victims have their response, but when the institution starts to implement ways to protect, not only to protect women, and to be frankly, when the perpetrators start to actually experience consequences, honestly, that was the shift. The shift is when we saw Weinstein in those handcuffs, because we've seen so many images of poverty-stricken Black and brown men in handcuffs. But when you see someone who has that kind of societal power, that then has these kinds of it starts to put across this collective consciousness of like, oh, I think it's like dismantling this like masculine aggression.
Mhm.
And when I saw it was a very visceral response for myself when I saw the image of that man in that position, because it is something that we never thought the person who, for myself, I had my own personal Weinstein in my life, right? Not Weinstein, but there was like, I was in those moments. I was like, I experienced those things. And it was very kind of like a collective cathartic thing to see him, dismantled that way. But I think that's institutional. And I think that once our field, every single theater, every single organization starts to have like a common language around this, I think that for me was really powerful, and whether it was obligatory in the beginning, when you saw corporations and all these other institutions having mandatory trainings, or, I said, oh, this is when the institutions start to respond, all of a sudden, I think women feel we are in a different place, because we know that we don't only just need, like community organizational support. We need these institutions that we're a part of to also follow through and to have, even if it's a starting place. To me, that was the beginning of something huge. And that how can we continue to, whatever organization or institution we work, how can we start to, put those practices inside the organization?
Mm-hmm.
There's another question about what the panelists recommend for women who have successfully exited situations of domestic violence, are no longer partnered with an abuser. Are there resources you like and recommend?
That's a strange. It's hard to understand what the question is. Are these support, or are these people who have left the situation but are still in danger?
Left the situation but want continued support, sort of post leaving, is my understanding of the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that support circles can be a great place. And what support circles are, I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to this. Is I was trained as a therapist and really realized the limitations of therapy almost immediately. And thought about how can we bring some of the ethos of therapy out of the back office of a windowless room and into communities, but with an awareness of social identity and with facilitators who have a deep commitment to knowing their own shit so that they don't perpetuate violence on others. And so these are non-judgmental, real talk spaces with sometimes in communities. So we do them in flower shops, like I said, laundry mats, art spaces. So really to bring creativity into these conversations as well. Meditation domes, and you can just sort of show up, and they're topic based, and some of them are just for gender based. We also do rage groups and groups for men in particular, and looking at cultural influences, not just sort of the personal stuff, but the institutional stuff as well. So yeah, those are, I shared one resource in the guide, but then the other resource is called Spoke Circles, and those are free to $15, and they're currently digital, but they will be in the community. And facilitators are all people just who are incredibly skilled in holding space. So we have hairdressers, we have writers who are leading up Latinx coverage at the New York Times. We have a man who's leading gay men's retreats around the US. So there's really a diversity of people to connect to, and to really find your circle and have your voice heard and hear the voices of others that are saying, you know, in the words of Bell Hooks, speak, tell me your story.
Great, that is so helpful. One of the attendees had some suggestion for some Mount Sinai training actually tomorrow that I just texted to everybody. This is a question / idea. Most people are at home watching CNN programming or other programming about COVID and turning into Cuomo and President Trump's daily briefings. I've been surprised and disappointed that interviews and panels and the task force and government officials are not trying to educate people at home about domestic violence, especially when there's a large audience sheltered at home. And while it is so crucial, knowing that many of the homes these TVs are reaching are being directly impacted by domestic violence, is there a possibility of advocating somehow to get governors and CNNers to talk about this more on TV, provide links and resources, directly address abusers or victims? Cuomo has been great about talking about some other aspects of the situation. I do not see people interviewed talking about this or providing advice and resources for abusers, victims, or allies.
Yeah, we have to do a lot more of it. The governor did just announce a new domestic violence statewide text and chat line. So there has been a little coverage. The city's also done some, the First Lady has done some PSAs specifically around domestic violence and COVID. But I totally agree. There's a lot more that needs to get done. You know, this is the, you know, 1 in 4 women will be a victim of domestic violence at some point in their lives, and yet this is, you know, a conversation that we don't often have publicly, and we need to have a lot more. So I totally agree, and I think, you know, I think there's some being done, but we could do a lot better.
Yeah. Yes. You know, one of my community partners, Janos Martin at the ACLU, he's been doing programming around incarcerated people, incarcerated women, and how you know, survivors of domestic violence who have been, you know, criminalized are then now further at risk during COVID, or, you know, there's been very little, you know, national coverage in terms of like what's happening to undocumented communities, even though the administration has been clearly intentionally starving out the undocumented community and any immigrant, and then even the people, spouses of immigrants. I think it's so intentional, where they're just, I think it's also like a strategy of the current administration, is that there's so much happening, and that the culture has now turned to inward and taking care of myself, and further creating fear and isolation, so that there is no solidarity, right? So it's like, we're not thinking like, if people are going out and just hoarding everything for themselves, which is like what we're in this like state of fear, we don't, all of a sudden it's like, what happened? You know, an entire Navajo tribe is being wiped out intentionally, or like undocumented women are intentionally being, you know, so I think that they're using this opportunity to really target vulnerable communities intentionally. And it's been incredible on Facebook. People have been sharing resources, and I've been getting resources from organizations that I work with who have been sending me action items and places where you can donate or volunteer time. One of them being, you know, of course, our essential workers, which so many of them being undocumented. And now there's this visibility where it's like, oh, the person I most depend on is the person I most ignored in New York City. You know, all of the undocumented domestic, you know, essential workers all of a sudden have a visibility. One of the resources I gave was a group in Brooklyn called the Workers' Justice Project. And there is a movement where they said, in solidarity, to give part of your stimulus check to this group. So this idea that we can redirect our stimulus check to the communities that they wanted to starve out. So I think that to me was a wonderful strategy. There's a wonderful organization in Brooklyn, and the finances are going to essential workers who are continuing to work, or those who are vulnerable and didn't receive a stimulus check. So I'm thinking that's also a very creative way, is to take this stimulus check that was denied to others and to redirect it into these other communities.
We have another question. What has been the church's role and involvement in responding to domestic violence?
Mixed. I think, you know, I think there are a number of churches, and I think of a number of in New York, like right now, there's a number of churches that are working on looking at issues of custody, where in domestic violence cases where families have split up, and being able to provide support for those families. I think churches are a really important piece of community, and I think the issue becomes about how leadership in churches understand domestic violence and understand you know, the kind of tension between like wanting to keep families together and couples together, and making sure that those are safe spaces for people. And there's a lot of really strong leaders in churches and mosques and synagogues that really understand this dynamic, and there's a lot of educating to do too in religious communities.
Great. I think those are all the questions, except you got a comment, Marin, about how exciting it is that you're writing, and what are your plans for the play. And then, so if you want to share a little bit about the play and the content and all that, that would be great.
Yeah, that's nice to hear. Yeah, you know, I guess as with anything, especially right now, there's no plans for anything until we know anything further. But it's been a long journey working on it, and you know, this was a really good atmosphere to introduce some pieces of it out into the wider world. But yeah, sort of taking it one day at a time, as with everything right now.
Maybe this is a beautiful segue to be able to hear Kathy read an excerpt of the play as well. For these panels, it's really important that we begin and end with pieces of theater. The role that art and theater can play in grappling with everything that we're talking about feels so essential. And it is really an honor and a privilege to be able to have the generous and expert eyes and ears of these fabulous women with us today, and all of you listening, truly. So we are very, very grateful to all of you. But I'm so honored we get to hear Kathy read a section of this play as well. Such a beautiful actress. So maybe we'll segue over to you, Kathy.
Well, I'm very pleased to read this. I've known Marin almost since she came here. I've watched her grow from a very young woman to this extraordinarily accomplished person that she is now, and to discover this new part about her is very exciting. So I'm honored to be able to read this part of her play. Don't forget that there's a lot of manipulation happening here. He still has some control over you, especially when you're alone. His voice is still in your head, right? And it doesn't help that this kind of issue makes people uncomfortable and they'd rather it be over. And in this world we live in, it's very, very easy to blame victims. Why did she get in that car? Why was she wearing such a slutty outfit? Why did she go to that party? All that kind of stuff. And yes, there is something true about our own choices and our own personal responsibility, yes. And you were yelling at him, you were fighting, but you did not deserve this in response. And it really comes down to that, what you think you deserve, because that's where you're going to stay stuck. And that's why you're going to believe that you're the one who should be shamed here. And this is our real work. It's hard work. It's not about him. It's about you. And it might take a really, really long time. And people say that time heals. But I don't buy that. It doesn't really heal. But it passes. That's about all I can say. Time passes.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and really thank you to all of you. This is really just the beginning, or the middle, or something of a very deep and intense conversation. So for some of us, it's the beginning. For some, it's the middle. The resources are sent to you to help you find pathways of support to help those that you love and care about, to check in on them, or to help yourselves. And we're doing this Salon series every week at 3 p.m. It's really been eye-opening in this time of free falling, to be able to free fall together on really in very moving and urgent questions of today. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have a very safe rest of your day, and stay loved and stay connected.